Major Arthur James Campbell tastes metal in his mouth before he even realizes he is grinding his teeth. Hunched low in the commander's hatch of a cheap Canadian Sherman that rattles like an overworked farm truck as it claws up a Norman slope northeast of Falaise. It is 17th of August 1944, but to him dates have lost their meaning. The world has shrunk to the stink of cordite, gasoline, sweat soaked into wool, and the constant background chorus of wounded engines and distant artillery that never, ever stops. Somewhere beyond the next line of hedgerows and smoke is the last open corridor out of the Falaise Pocket, the last strip of road where what remains of the German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army are trying to escape east toward the Seine before the noose closes for good. The orders shoved into his hands that morning were brutally simple. Move with the South Alberta Regiment and other Canadian armour to choke off that road and sit on it, no matter what comes. "You'll probably see tigers," his squadron leader had said in a voice that tried to sound calm and didn't quite manage it. "Remember the drills. Flank, close the distance, don't play their game." Arthur remembers the laugh that went around the briefing tent, harsh and thin. Everyone knew what tigers meant. Heavy German cats with 88 medium guns that could kill a Sherman from the 1,500 meters. The cheap green boxes they rode in needed to get under 500 to have any hope at all. It felt like telling a boxer with glass bones to close in on a heavyweight and trade punches inside. Now, as his Sherman lurches forward, he hears his gunner, Sergeant Robert Fraser, mutter into the intercom, "If they're tigers, we're dead men in boilers." No one contradicts him. They all know the numbers. Canadian armoured units in Normandy have been losing Shermans at terrifying rates for 2 months, sometimes trading 3, 4, 5 tanks for one German heavy. The joke in the brew-up clearing stations is that the Sherman's real design feature is that you can get out fast when it catches fire. They call them Ronsons after the lighter. Lights first time, every time. Arthur has seen it up close, has watched a friend's tank take a hit and turn into a vertical column of black smoke, with a sound like a giant exhaling. It is that memory, not the abstract idea of death, that makes his hands shake as he raises his binoculars and tries to see through the heat shimmer and drifting dust. Some part of him, the part that had worked in an Ontario garage before the war, still resents the word cheap that the Germans keep using in intercepted reports. Cheap American-built chassis, cheap Canadian crews, cheap Commonwealth armor, expendable and inferior. The radio intelligence types had read snippets at briefings. German staff officers dismissing Allied Shermans as massenware, mass-produced trash, things you can throw away because there will always be more. Now those same officers are trapped in a shrinking pocket. Tiger battalions mauled, fuel running out. Veterans reduced to walking east along cratered roads that reek of dead horses and burned rubber. Arthur wonders, not for the first time, what those men are saying now when they look through their own optics and see the silhouettes of Shermans grinding over the ridgelines around Troon and Chambois. Do they still think cheap, or do they think inevitable? The irony tastes bitter on his tongue. A nearby explosion slaps the air, showering his hatch with clods of dirt. The driver swears. Somewhere to their right, a Canadian tank brews up, a flaming pillar against the grey sky. Inside, Arthur feels something cold and hollow open up, the familiar quiet panic that has been his constant companion since July. He pushes it down. He has men in this steel box who need his voice steady. "Stay in line, keep interval," he says into the throat mic, and his voice, to his surprise, comes out almost calm. "We hold that road or nobody goes home." In the ruins ahead, men in black panzer uniforms are clambering onto their own machines, engines coughing to life. Somewhere in the chaos of the Falaise Pocket, tiger crews who had once believed they were untouchable kings of the battlefield are discovering what it feels like to be hunted, outnumbered, and short of everything that matters. The pocket is closing, and the cheap Shermans are still coming. The road to this moment began long before any Canadian crew saw the thick, slab-sided silhouette of a tiger through the gun sight. It began in the wreckage of 1940, when Hitler's panzers had carved through France and the Low Countries in weeks, when grainy newsreel images of German tanks rolling past burning French villages seared into the minds of every teenager in Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver, and Winnipeg. Back then, the idea of Canadian armor taking on German heavy tanks in Normandy would have seemed almost science fiction. Canada had gone into the war with virtually no modern tanks, its small permanent army more suited to colonial garrison duty than industrial land war in Europe. The men who would, 4 years later, be learning how to stalk tigers around villages like Saint-Lambert-sur-Dive were in the late 1930s mechanics, farmers, students, truck drivers. One of them, Private James Edward Ross, had been a 19-year-old farmhand in Saskatchewan, watching dust storms strip topsoil from his father's fields, while news on the radio talked of annexations and appeasement. Another, Corporal Henry MacDonald from Halifax, had worked in a shipyard, watching rusting freighters and thinking that Europe's problems were an ocean away. They grew up in a Canada shaped by the trauma of the Great Depression and by the memory of the First World War's slaughter. Many of their fathers had come back from Passchendaele and Vimy Ridge with nightmares, missing limbs, or both. The dominant lesson those men passed down was not glory, but cost. War was something you survived, not something you bragged about. And yet, in 1939, when the news came that Germany had invaded Poland and Britain had declared war, thousands of young Canadian men lined up anyway. Some were driven by loyalty to Britain, some by anger at fascism, some by restless hunger for something beyond dead-end jobs and barren fields. The government in Ottawa, more cautious than in 1914, promised no more blind sacrifices of Canadian lives under foreign generals. This time, Canadian units would fight as Canadian formations, with Canadian officers. That decision would echo all the way to the fields of Normandy in 1944, where the 2nd and 4th Canadian Armoured Brigades would go into battle not as anonymous attachments, but as spearheads in their own right. The technology they would take to that fight emerged from a world racing toward mechanized slaughter. In the 1930s, while Hitler poured resources into panzer divisions, German optics, and high-velocity guns, the United States experimented with medium tanks that balanced mobility, production cost, and firepower. The result, after much trial and error, was the M4 Sherman. It was not a wonder weapon. It was a compromise on tracks, a gasoline engine vulnerable to fire, relatively thin armor, a 75mm gun that would prove inadequate against late-war German heavy tanks frontally. But it was also simple, reliable, and above all buildable in huge numbers. For Canadians whose industry was smaller but tightly coupled to American production, the Sherman represented both opportunity and anxiety. Opportunity because with enough of them, Canadian armored regiments could finally match German numbers and mobility. Anxiety because everyone by 1943 had heard the stories coming back from the Italian front and from the Eastern Front. German heavies knocking out Shermans at long range, crews dying when ammunition racks ignited and turned the interior into an inferno. Canadian officers had to convince their men to climb into machines that they knew, on paper, were outclassed by Tigers and Panthers. Training manuals talked about tactics, flank shots, coordination with artillery, smoke, using numbers and flexibility to compensate for individual inferiority. But underneath the theory, there was the ugly reality that if a Tiger saw you first in open ground, no amount of doctrine would stop the 80mm round that turned your world into white flash and molten metal. That knowledge settled into the bones of Canadian tankers long before they saw Normandy. In the training grounds of England in 1943, where they learned gunnery on Salisbury Plain and practiced maneuvers in artificial villages that stank of cordite and wet chalk, nobody talked openly about burning. But at night, in canteens and barracks, they traded rumors. Stories of Shermans in North Africa cooking off. Tales of German crews casually withstanding hit after hit that bounced off their armor like stones. The Tiger tank, which had first appeared on the Eastern Front in late 1942, took on almost mythic proportions in Allied imaginations. Its silhouette, with the tall turret and heavy tracks, became the shape that stalked Canadian dreams months before they saw one. Yet on paper, German staff officers remained confident. Their memoranda described Shermans as inferiors, counted on kill ratios and armor thickness to maintain local superiority. They believed that superior German crews in superior German machines could offset Allied numerical advantage. as they had done in countless Eastern Front battles. What they could not see from map tables in Lorraine and Berlin was what constant attrition, fuel shortage, and overwhelming air power would do to that equation by the summer of 1944, when their Tigers were few, their best crews dead or exhausted, and the roads choked with refugees and retreating units. In Canada, back in the early war years, questions of technology mixed with questions of culture. How do you train a generation raised on stories of First World War futility to climb into thin-skinned tanks and drive toward guns they knew could kill them? Military psychologists, still using clumsy terminology but already aware of what shell shock had done to their father's generation, were brought into the training pipeline. Chaplains and officers alike were told to focus on unit cohesion, on making crews feel like families, so that the fear of letting each other down would outweigh the fear of death. Canadian propaganda films leaned into duty, yes, but also into competence. They showed calm young men climbing into Shermans, pulling on headphones, speaking in clipped, confident tones. The message, repeated again and again, was not that the Sherman was invincible, but that Canadian crews, properly trained and equipped, could outthink and outfight a technologically superior enemy. In the mess halls and barracks, those same men told each other a sharper truth. The tank was just a tool. What mattered was whether you trusted the man whose voice came crackling through your intercom when the world outside turned to fire and mud. That bond, the closed little universe of driver, gunner, loader, commander, co-driver, would be tested beyond imagination in the hedgerows and fields that led to Falaise. When the Canadians finally landed in Normandy in June 1944, most of them discovered quickly that the war they had trained for was not quite the war they were getting. Many had imagined sweeping armored maneuvers across open countryside, like the training exercises on Salisbury Plain, like the newsreels of the Blitzkrieg. Instead, they found themselves crawling forward through the bocage, a claustrophobic maze of hedgerows, sunken lanes, and small fields that turned every advance into an ambush waiting to happen. It was terrain perfectly suited to German defenders who knew it, and to heavy tanks like the Tiger, that could sit hull down behind a hedgerow and wait for silhouettes to appear. For Canadian Sherman crews, the first weeks in Normandy were a shock at multiple levels. The smell, above all, was different from anything they had trained for. Rotting livestock in fields hit by artillery, sweet sickly stench of human bodies left too long in the sun, diesel and gasoline fumes hanging low between the hedges. The soundscape was a constant layered thing, small arms snapping, occasional heavy crumps of artillery, the metallic screech of tracks, the high whine of incoming mortar rounds, and overlaying it all at seemingly random intervals, the shattering crack of an 88mm gun, firing somewhere beyond the hedgerows. For men who had heard about Tigers for years, every 88mm shot became psychologically attached to that image, whether it came from a Tiger, a self-propelled gun, or a towed anti-tank piece. The effect was the same in the gut. You heard that sound and every muscle tightened, waiting for the impact that might or might not be yours. The 2nd Canadian Armoured Brigade and the armoured regiments attached to the 3rd and 4th Canadian Infantry Divisions were thrown again and again into battles south of Caen, operations Totalize and Tractable, that chewed up men and machines at horrifying rates. In those August offensives, as Canadian forces tried to break through toward Falaise, they faced not only entrenched German infantry and anti-tank guns, but elements of elite panzer divisions, including units equipped with Tigers. The German crews, many veterans of the Eastern Front, knew exactly what their machines could do in this terrain. Their doctrine was simple: let the Shermans come into range, ambush from prepared positions, withdraw before Allied artillery and fighter bombers could respond. In debriefings, Canadian survivors described the same sick pattern, advancing across what looked like an empty field, nothing but burning farmhouses on the horizon, then suddenly Shermans exploding in the line ahead, turrets blown off without any visible enemy. Frantic calls over the radio: "Where the hell are they? Where is he shooting from?" And no answer except more hits, more black pillars of smoke. For one Canadian gunner, Private Edward Wilson, the worst part was the invisible nature of the threat. He later wrote in a letter, never sent and found decades later in a family attic: that fighting tigers felt like being hunted by a predator you could not see or hear until it decided to strike. "You feel like a rabbit in a field with a hawk somewhere overhead," he wrote. "You keep telling yourself, if I keep moving, if I keep my head down, maybe he'll pick somebody else. And then you hate yourself for thinking that." The Germans, for their part, were not the invulnerable machines of Allied myth. By the time of the Falaise fighting, many Tiger crews were exhausted, under strength, and chronically short of fuel. The great strengths of their tanks, heavy armor, powerful guns, came with crippling drawbacks in a war of retreat. Tigers guzzled fuel. They were mechanically temperamental. Recovery of a damaged Tiger under fire was a nightmare. In the chaos of the withdrawal toward the Falaise-Chambouat area, more than one crew was forced to disable and abandon their beloved monster because there simply wasn't enough petrol to keep it running. For the men inside, that felt like tearing out a part of themselves. A veteran Tiger commander, Oberfeldwebel Hans Kramer, whose words would be discovered after the war in a brittle, mud-stained letter never posted, wrote that leaving his first Tiger behind in a ditch near Villa Bocage hurt more than any wound. "We knew she was just steel," he wrote, "but she was also our home, our weapon, the thing that had kept us alive since Kursk. Walking away from her felt like walking naked into a storm." That sense of vulnerability only deepened as German units became aware of how many Allied tanks they were facing. By mid-August, Canadian armored formations were part of a vast Allied pincer that included British Guards armored, American armored divisions pushing from the south, and Polish units clawing toward Chambouat. A single Tiger crew could still dominate a field, still kill Shermans faster than they could count, but the numbers were now grotesquely out of balance. For every Tiger that survived to reach the vicinity of Trun or Saint-Lambert, there were dozens upon dozens of Allied Shermans, Cromwells and Fireflies moving on converging axes. German staff officers, who had once compared Allied medium tanks to disposable tin cans, were now scribbling frantic notes about ammunition shortages, fuel rationing, and the impossibility of holding any fixed line for more than a day. In the dugouts and commandeered French farmhouses where they spread their maps, the red pencil arrows of Allied advances seemed to multiply every morning. For those German officers, the word cheap took on a new, terrifying meaning. Cheap meant there would always be more. Cheap meant that every Tiger knocked out might cost 3, 5, 10 Shermans, but the Shermans kept coming, and there were no replacement Tigers waiting on trains from Germany. Meanwhile, in Canadian units, the cost was counted in far smaller, more intimate numbers. A troop commander like Arthur Campbell didn't think in terms of brigade totals. He thought in terms of the 3 or 4 other tanks whose crews he knew by name, whose faces he saw in the shaving mirrors every morning. When one of those tanks brewed up, it was not a statistic. It was the smell of burning paint and rubber and flesh, the memory of a joke told in the slit trench the night before, cut off forever. By the time Canadian Shermans were pushing into the killing fields around the Dives River, most crews had buried at least one friend, sometimes entire crews they had trained with for years. The trauma accumulated like shrapnel in the psyche. Some men began to grow numb, moving and fighting on automatic. Their emotional range narrowed to simple tasks: traverse, range, fire, button up, open hatch. Others developed rituals to ward off fear: lucky cigarettes before starting engines, muttered prayers as they slammed the hatch shut, photos of home taped near the gun site. None of it could change the brutal arithmetic that defined their days. And yet they kept moving, day after day, hour after hour, into towns whose names they could barely pronounce, across fields littered with burned-out vehicles of both sides, toward a pocket that was about to become one of the great killing grounds of the Western Front. In German briefing rooms, men in staff collars were beginning to say something they would never have imagined in 1941, that the supposedly cheap Canadian Shermans had become not only a tactical problem, but a psychological one, a rolling symbol that the industrial and human weight of the Allies could not be stopped by a handful of elite crews in elite machines. By the morning of 20th August, the so-called corridor out of the Falaise Pocket is no longer a road in any normal sense of the word. It is a wound carved into the Norman countryside, clogged with wreckage and bodies, stinking under a pale sun that seems far too gentle for the things it shines on. Major Arthur James Campbell blinks grit out of his eyes and tries, not for the first time, to impose order on what he sees through his binoculars. It is impossible. The narrow strip of ground between Train, Saint-Lambert-sur-Dive, Chambois, and the high ground where the Poles are fighting has become a churning mass of men and metal. Columns that began as organized German formations have dissolved into tangled streams of vehicles, horse-drawn carts and infantry, all trying to squeeze through gaps that grow smaller by the hour. From Arthur's position near Saint-Lambert, he can see the Dives River choked with destroyed trucks and drowned horses, their bloated bodies wedged against makeshift bridges that were supposed to carry the remnants of the 7th Army east. Now those bridges are killing grounds. Canadian and Polish tanks sit hull down on the approaches, guns traversing slowly, waiting for anything on the far bank that still moves with hostile intent. Somewhere in that churn of smoke and confusion are the last operable German heavy tanks, Tigers and Panthers pushed forward to cover retreat routes or thrown into desperate counterattacks to punch holes through Canadian and Polish lines. For their crews, each engagement now is not about gaining ground or achieving operational objectives. It is a simple, brutal question. Can we buy our comrades enough time to get away, and can we somehow survive doing it? In one battered Tiger positioned near a crossroads southeast of Trun, Oberfeldwebel Hans Kramer wipes sweat from his eyes with the back of his hand and peers again through his gun sight. The glass is streaked with grime and the faint scratches of months of field use. Through it he sees a scene that might as well have been drawn from some nightmare scripture. A narrow road lined with shell craters, civilian wagons piled with furniture, and terrified children trying to push past disabled half-tracks. Wounded soldiers limping with arms in slings or heads bandaged, all under a sky crisscrossed by the contrails of Allied aircraft. In the distance, beyond a copse of trees, the vague, boxy outlines of Allied tanks appear and disappear in the heat haze. Hans's loader slams another 80 mm round into the breach with a practiced motion that has become almost automatic. Feindliche Panzer, 8 Uhr, the gunner says, voice flat. Enemy tanks at 8 o'clock. There is no drama left in the words, they are an hourly occurrence now. Hans gives the order to fire because that is what he does, what he has done since he first climbed into a Tiger in 1943. The recoil hammers the turret. Through the sight, he sees the shell hit a Sherman square in the front hull. For a second, the Canadian tank seems to pause, as if confused. Then the front armor gives, the tank jerks to a stop, and white-grey smoke begins pouring out of the hatches. Inside the Tiger, no one cheers. There is a muttered treffer from the gunner, a small note of satisfaction, but it fades quickly as the sight picture fills again with more green hulls grinding forward. Hans feels a strange, distant sympathy for the men who just died. He knows in the abstract that they are the enemy, that every burning Sherman means fewer shells crashing into German positions, fewer Allied infantry breaking through the thinning lines. But he also knows what it feels like to be inside a steel box when it is hit. He has seen burned German crews pulled out of their vehicles, faces unrecognizable, hands fused to metal. Fire does not care about uniforms. He finds himself thinking, absurdly, about how the Canadians must talk among themselves about Tigers. Do they curse the big cats, talk about them as monsters? Do they give them nicknames? He remembers hearing from a rear area staff officer that the Allies call their Shermans Ronsons because they light so easily. At the time it had amused him, now it makes him vaguely sick. He wonders what that staff officer would say if he could see this corridor, this slaughterhouse under the open sky. The Tiger's engine note changes subtly, a low cough that every member of the crew recognizes as a bad sign. Fuel is low. They have been idling and firing for hours, reversing into new positions, crawling forward again, never fully switching off in case they need to move at a moment's notice. Hans glances down at the fuel gauge and feels a cold, animal fear slide into his gut. If they run dry here in this exposed position, with Allied aircraft overhead and Canadian armor closing, their magnificent machine will become a coffin. He keys his throat microphone, calls over the net for resupply, for orders. The reply crackles back, full of static and strain. There is no more fuel to send, no clear line of retreat. Hold as long as you can. Every minute matters. In that moment, Hans understands with complete clarity that the Tiger's battlefield supremacy, the thick armor, the devastating gun, has become a trap. All that mass, all that engineering brilliance is no use without the most basic logistical reality: fuel in the tank. The enemy Shermans, for all their comparative weakness, are never short of it. They seem to roll in waves, one after another, as if the factories that built them are just over the next hill. Cheap, he thinks, but they're everywhere. Meanwhile, in the hollow where Arthur's Sherman and a handful of others crouch like squat animals in ambush, the Canadian crews are learning their own version of that same lesson. That humanity and survival in this kind of war come down to a series of decisions made in seconds, moments when you choose to fire or to hold, to expose yourself for a shot or stay hidden and watch someone else die. A runner from the South Alberta Regiment's headquarters has just delivered new orders. The village and crossing at Saint-Lambert-sur-Dive must be held against all attempts to break through. They are the cork in the bottle, and the bottle is almost bursting with the pressure of 30 to 40,000 trapped Germans trying to pour out. Arthur reads the typed message in the fading light and feels a kind of dull resignation. They have been holding already. Now it is simply official. He looks around at what is left of his troop. 3 Shermans, including his own, all scarred, paint-chipped by shrapnel, sandbags piled on their front glacis in the hope that a little extra mass will blunt a shaped charge. The infantry around them, Argyll's and Lincoln and Welland men, are foxhole thin, uniforms crusted with dirt and blood. Many have not slept properly in days. He can see it in the way they move, the slight lag in reaction time, the 1,000-yard stares that settle in when the firing stops for a few minutes. Yet when he orders his driver to edge forward to a better firing position covering the main street, they all move with that same terrible efficiency that battle hammers into men. Weapons checked, arcs of fire established, lanes of fire agreed with a few murmured words. They have done this too often for it to feel strange anymore. Night brings no relief. If anything, it intensifies the horror. The battlefield becomes a flickering landscape of muzzle flashes and burning vehicles, casting pulsing light over fields and orchards. Every sound is magnified in the darkness. The clank of tracks as German vehicles attempt one more dash for freedom, the shrill cries of wounded horses, the ragged shouts of men in German and French and accented English. Arthur sits half out of his hatch, binoculars pressed to his face, scanning for movement. His neck aches from the strain. He forces himself to sip at lukewarm tea from his canteen, to chew on a hard biscuit he can barely swallow. He knows from grim experience that if he lets his blood sugar crash, fatigue will make him slow, and slow commanders get people killed. Around midnight, a flare goes up somewhere to the south, bathing the landscape in a ghostly white light. In that moment he sees them, a cluster of German vehicles. Half-tracks, a truck or two, and at the edge of his vision, something bigger, squarer. His mind translates the shape, even before his eyes fully resolve it. A tiger or a panther, it hardly matters which at this distance. "Target, enemy tank, 2 o'clock, 600 yards, he calls down into the turret. His gunner, Fraser, swings the turret as he has hundreds of times in practice and dozens in battle. The Firefly attached to them is already slewing its long gun, its commander having seen the same thing from a slightly different angle. On the enemy side, in whatever German command vehicle is still functioning, someone is undoubtedly shouting orders, urging the drivers forward, promising that if they can just punch through this knot of Canadian tanks and anti-tank guns, there is open country and safety beyond. For a few seconds, everything becomes a contest of reflexes, training, luck. The German heavy tank fires first. The flash blinds Arthur, a searing white rectangle against the night. A split second later, a Sherman 2 vehicles over erupts, turret top lifting, a sheet of flame jetting out of the commander's hatch. Someone inside is screaming, a sound that cuts through the roar of engines and guns like a knife. Fraser's shot goes out a heartbeat later. Through the magnified view, Arthur sees the enemy tank shudder as the 17-pounder round hits near the front of the turret ring. For a moment, the tank keeps moving, a wounded animal in motion. Then it stops. Flames lick out around the mantlet. Figures scramble on the hull, one falling, cloak of fire around his body as he rolls. On the Canadian net, there is no cheering, only curt acknowledgements. "Target. Hit. He's done." the practical language of killing. In the relative lull that follows, with the immediate threat neutralized and the burning Sherman still casting flickering light over the ditch where medics work frantically, another kind of conversation begins, one that will echo in these men's minds for decades. In the turret, Fraser speaks quietly, almost as if to himself. "How many more do they have?" Arthur, eyes still on the road, answers without thinking. "Enough to kill us if we give them the chance." Fraser is silent for a moment and then says, "We're the ones closing the trap. But when you look at this," he gestures vaguely at the landscape of burning vehicles and bodies, "who's trapped with who?" It is a strange, unsettling thought. The Germans are the ones physically encircled, but the Canadians are trapped too. In this mission, in this murderous strip of ground, in the logic of total war that demands the annihilation or capture of whole armies. Arthur does not reply. He has no answer that would make sense. At dawn, the scale of the Pocket's destruction becomes visible in a way that was impossible in the dark. Arthur clambers down from his tank for the first time in hours and walks a short distance along the road, sidearm holstered but feeling naked without the thick iron skin of his Sherman around him. The air is heavy and still, carrying the layered smell of explosives, burned rubber, spilled fuel, and death. He steps around a dead horse, its flank bloated, flies buzzing. Nearby, a Tiger sits half off the road, one track blown off, its hull pocked by shell impacts. The turret hatch is open. A blackened shape lies half out of it, one arm extended toward the ground, fingers clawed. The man's uniform is burned enough that Arthur cannot tell his rank. For a moment, he stands there, looking up at the tank that has haunted his dreams for months. Up close, it is undeniably impressive. Thick plates, massive gun, everything about it radiating the industrial arrogance of a regime that believed it could over-engineer its way out of any problem. And yet, here it is, dead like all the rest, one more obstacle in a mad traffic jam of annihilation. He finds himself wondering, unbidden, what the crew had said to each other in their last minutes. Had they cursed the Canadians and their cheap Shermans? Had they raged at their own high command for ordering them into an impossible situation? Had they, like him, felt mostly a tired, bewildered sorrow that it had come to this? Years later, long after the war, when he sits in his small house in Ontario and the news shows grainy black and white footage of the Falaise Pocket, the roads choked with corpses, the aerial shots of fields dotted with wrecks like toys discarded by a giant child, Arthur will think not of victory but of this moment, standing by a dead tiger and feeling no triumph, only a heavy, inarticulate grief. For now, though, there is no time for reflection. A staff car arrives with fresh orders. The gap must be held another day. German attempts to break through are expected to continue. Resupply will be difficult. The roads behind are almost as clogged as the ones in front. He climbs back into his Sherman, bones aching, and closes the hatch. Inside, the air is ripe with sweat, oil and the faint tang of cordite embedded into every surface. His crew look at him expectantly. He gives the only order he can. Same positions, we're not done yet. Outside, in fields and ditches and broken orchards, German soldiers who have finally thrown away their weapons shuffle forward with hands raised, eyes unfocused. Some collapse where they stand, too exhausted to move another step. Canadian infantry herd them back behind the lines. Among them, somewhere, are former Tiger crewmen who will spend the rest of the war in cages in England or Canada, telling anyone who will listen that it was not enemy genius that defeated them, but weight. Weight of metal, weight of fuel, weight of men and machines. And walking past them in the other direction are Canadian tankers heading back toward the front, faces grey with fatigue, knowing that the closing of the Falaise Pocket, which higher command will one day hail as a decisive victory, has demanded a price that cannot be tallied in numbers alone. By the morning of 20th August, the so-called corridor out of the Falaise Pocket is no longer a road in any normal sense of the word. It is a wound carved into the Norman countryside, clogged with wreckage and bodies, stinking under a pale sun that seems far too gentle for the things it shines on. Major Arthur James Campbell blinks grit out of his eyes and tries, not for the first time, to impose order on what he sees through his binoculars. It is impossible. The narrow strip of ground between Troun-Saint-Lambert-sur-Dive, Chambois and the high ground where the Poles are fighting has become a churning mass of men and metal, the culmination of weeks of attrition in which German formations that once prided themselves on precision and discipline have dissolved into desperate streams of fugitives. Somewhere out there in that churn are the last operable German heavy tanks, Tigers and Panthers, pushed forward to cover retreat routes or thrown into counterattacks that would have been called local counter-thrusts on neat situation maps, but on the ground feel like last wild swings of a man already falling. For Canadian crews like Arthur's, the day begins not with clarity but with noise. The constant rumble of engines, the distant thud of artillery, the ragged crackle of small arms fire drifting over from hedgerows and orchards where infantry are still killing each other over ditches and farmyards. The smell inside his Sherman is the same as always now. Sweat, oil, stale air tinged with cordite. But when he pops the hatch and stands half out to scan, a second smell hits him, stronger with every passing day. The sweet, cloying rot of unburied flesh. Men and horses both. The division's medical officers had warned them that if the pocket wasn't closed quickly enough, disease would follow, as sure as flies follow carrion. No one knows yet that in 50-60 years' time, historians will look back on this place and call it a cauldron, a killing ground, an example of successful encirclement. For the men inside the ring of steel and the men tightening it, those words would sound obscene. It is simply hell, and they are all standing in it on different sides of a shrinking circle. On the German side of that circle, in a farmhouse commandeered as a temporary command post near the village of Fresnay, a staff captain named Friedrich Lennartz is trying to keep track of units that no longer really exist. His maps are a mess of pencil marks, crossed-out symbols, and arrows that lead nowhere. Every time he updates a position, it is already outdated by the time his hand leaves the paper. Divisional headquarters that ought to be miles apart are jammed together in the same narrow strip of countryside, each begging the others for fuel, ammunition, any news of a clear escape route. Reports come in of Canadian and Polish armor cutting the road at one point, of American units appearing suddenly to the south, of artillery falling on convoys that had been promised air cover and received none. Within that chaos, the Tiger and Panther companies have become both talisman and curse. Everyone wants them where the fighting is heaviest, where the enemy is breaking through, where the pocket wall is thinnest. Everyone assumes that if a Tiger can be parked astride a road, it will somehow turn the tide, as if the mere physical presence of 57 tons of German steel can conjure fuel, shells and new men. Lennartz has read the reports from earlier in the campaign, the cool evaluations that talk about kill ratios and effective ranges, about how Tigers in Normandy have repeatedly blunted Allied armoured thrusts. The numbers are impressive. They are also, he knows now, meaningless. They do not capture what the last 2 weeks have done to the men who fight inside those machines. They do not mention what happens when you send the same crews into battle day after day, with almost no rest, when they sleep in snatches in their turrets, boots on, pistols close at hand, ears half-tuned for the sound of approaching tracks. They do not talk about the way veterans who once joked about Tommies in their kettles now talk about Allied tanks with a kind of grim respect, even fear, not because the Shermans have become better, but because they never seem to stop. When Lennartz writes his daily situation summary, he hesitates over the phrase he has been trained to use: Feindliche Panzer in großer Zahl, enemy tanks in great numbers. It feels inadequate. He wants to write what his battalion commanders are actually saying over the net, in voices roughened by exhaustion and disbelief. They are everywhere. For everyone we kill, 3 more appear. They come at night. They come through the orchards. They keep coming. He does not write that, of course. Reports are supposed to be precise, unemotional. He settles for numbers, grids, times. Yet when he folds the paper and hands it to a messenger, he has the uncomfortable sense that he is lying by omission. Not about facts, but about what those facts feel like for the men trapped out there, trying to get through the gauntlet, while Canadian and Polish crews close in with their cheap, stubborn machines. Back at Saint-Lambert, Arthur's world has shrunk to a few hundred meters of ground and the men inside his tank. They have slept little, eaten badly, and lived for nearly 48 hours with the near-constant expectation that someone, somewhere, is drawing a bead on them. When a lull comes, a genuine lull, 10 minutes without incoming rounds or shouts over the radio, Arthur feels an almost painful temptation to climb out, lie on a patch of grass and close his eyes. Instead, he forces himself to go through mechanical checks with his crew. It isn't just about the tank, it's about giving their minds something solid to hold on to. "How's she doing, Jimmy?" he asks his driver. The reply comes back with a hint of forced cheer. "Tracks are all right, sir. Engine sounds like my uncle's tractor after a bad night, but she'll hold." They all smile at that, because the image is so mundane, so far from the apocalyptic landscape outside, that it almost feels obscene. The loader checks ammunition. The numbers are lower than Arthur would like. Enough for another engagement or two, not enough for the day he has been told to hold. On the net, he hears other troop leaders voicing similar concerns. Supply trucks are supposed to be on their way, but the back routes up from the Canadian rear areas are choked with their own wrecks and prisoners. The same physical bottleneck that is killing the Germans is throttling Canadian logistics too. Cheap Shermans, he thinks. But everyone has to be fed with shells and petrol driven up roads that can kill you without a single enemy shot fired, just with bad luck and a stray bomb. Around midday, a group of German soldiers emerge from a copse of trees near the river, hands raised. There are dozens of them, maybe more than 100, uniforms filthy, faces gaunt. Some are bandaged. A few stumble and fall, get up again, as if their bodies have forgotten how to move without a load of gear. Canadian infantry move out to meet them, weapons at the ready but not quite as tight on the trigger as the day before. The surrender has a strange, almost hesitant quality, as if the Germans cannot quite believe it is happening, as if some part of them expects to be mowed down. Arthur watches from his hatch, binoculars up. He sees one of the German NCOs stop, turn, and look back toward the west, where the smoke is thickest. Even from this distance, the posture is eloquent. Arthur wonders what the man is leaving behind. Friends, comrades, a broken machine that had meant safety once. It occurs to him for the first time that for some of these men, surrendering to the Canadians in their inferior tanks may feel like a betrayal not of country, but of an entire identity built around the myth of technical and tactical superiority. In the afternoon, a small group of prisoners is marched past his tank toward the rear. Among them, by the distinctive black panzer uniforms and the tanker overalls dusted with soot, are men who have almost certainly served in the very heavy units his superiors have been obsessed with for months. One of them, a man in his late 20s with grease ingrained in the lines of his hands and a faint burn scar along his jaw, glances up as he passes and meets Arthur's eyes for the briefest moment. There is no hatred there, no defiance, only a look of hollow exhaustion and something that might be confusion. Arthur has the sudden, disorienting impression that the man is as baffled by all of this as he is, that in some other universe they could have swapped places, a German farm boy in a Sherman, a Canadian mechanic in a Tiger. It is a thought he will not dare voice to anyone in his unit, not yet. War makes it dangerous to see too much of yourself in the enemy. But the thought lodges deep. For German tank crews like that man, the myths they grew up with, that German steel is the best in the world, that German engineers make machines that cannot be matched, that discipline and training will always trump mass, have been eroding for months. Now here, in the shrinking cauldron, those myths finally collapse under the weight of simple, brutal arithmetic. They know in their bones that the cheap Allied tanks have won not because they are better in any individual duel, but because the system that produces and supports them is inexhaustible in a way Germany's can never be. That realization is its own kind of trauma, different from the shock of combat, but no less deep. Years later, when some of these men sit in small West German apartments or Canadian Legion halls, trying to put into words what Falaise meant, they will reach for metaphors: drowning, avalanches, storms. The common thread will be helplessness, the feeling of being caught in a process so much bigger than any individual decision that personal bravery or skill becomes almost irrelevant. In Arthur's part of the line, that process grinds on hour by hour. New waves of Germans try to break through, some in vehicles, some on foot, some in ad hoc groups led by whatever officer still has the energy to shout. Each time the Canadians and Poles and the artillery behind them smash them back. Each time, more bodies pile up in ditches, more wrecks block the way. The tiger, the symbol of German armoured might, appears only rarely now, and when it does, it is as often burning or abandoned as fighting. The mythology that surrounded it in Canadian minds, that of the invincible beast, has begun to fade, replaced by a more complicated, more unsettling image. That of a magnificent but doomed animal brought down not by a single heroic hunter, but by exhaustion, scarcity, and being in the wrong place at the wrong time in history. Late that evening, as the sun sinks red through the haze, Arthur sits with his back against the inside of the turret, head tipped back, eyes closed for a moment. His crew are silent around him, each lost in their own exhausted thoughts. They have done everything asked of them. The gap is, for all practical purposes, closed. Tomorrow and the next day will be mopping up, or so the officers say. Yet there is no sense of victory in the cramped steel box, only a bone-deep fatigue and a nagging awareness that what they have just helped to do, trap and destroy the core of a German army, will be remembered as a triumph in official histories, stripped of the smells and screams and the sight of that one tiger, half off the road, with its crew sprawled like discarded mannequins in the dust. Arthur knows better. He has seen the price from both sides of his gun sight. And in the years to come, when people ask him what it felt like to face German tigers with cheap Canadian Shermans in the closing of the Falaise Pocket, he will struggle to answer, because the true answer is not about tanks at all. It is about men trapped inside them on both sides, learning in the hardest possible way that steel and doctrine and pride are nothing against the grinding, indifferent machinery of a war that has already decided, long before they met on that French road, who would live and who would burn.